So we are very excited this morning here in Anchorage at Arctic Sea Ice to have our guest speaker, Andrew Kinsey. Andrew is the Senior Marine Risk Consultant for Allianz, and one of the reasons we reached out and really wanted to garner his perspective is that commercial entrance into the Arctic, whether that's shipping, whether that is some type of technological advancement, all of it comes with risk. And understanding kind of the global insurance market's perspective on shipping risk really helps us better figure out where the gaps lie, what technology we need to develop, or education products. So we're very excited to have Andrew with us this morning. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Andrew, and let you share your presentation.
Why, thank you very much, Kelsey. And once again, thank you for inviting me to present here today. Just a little bit of background on myself. I've been in commercial marine risk consulting for a bit over a decade, and prior to that, I spent 25 years sailing deep sea, mostly with Maersk, both Danish and U.S. flag. And I've had family. I grew up in the maritime industry, and I have my youngest son is actually up at Maine Maritime right now, continuing in the maritime tradition. So this is something that I take to heart, both from a commercial as well as a personal aspect. And I just wanted to start with some, really touching on some of the challenges of Arctic operation from a mariner standpoint and a commercial marine insurance standpoint. And as you will hear over these next several days, the human, technical, environmental challenges. It's a harsh environment. And we'll find the limits on both crew and machinery in such an environment. And it's been that way for as long as man has gone to sea. But we really need to get a little background of marine insurance and shipping routes to understand what a really seismic shift this is in maritime transport and supply chains. And in today's environment, supply chains has really risen in a lot of people's lexicon. If you look at what the COVID-19 pandemic has done, it's really heightened the challenges of a just-in-time supply chain and the outsourcing of many productions and also the limited warehousing. So if you look in any trade publication or even now financial news, you will see supply chains front and center. So as we look at this, we have to understand the challenges of opening up a new shipping route, but then also challenges of changing supply chains. So from historical content, marine insurance is based on history. That's really how we come up with rates and how we rate and how we look at risk. And it's the oldest form of insurance, as many marine insurers will tell you, and some date back to 1350 and then, of course, the Lloyd's Coffee House, with Lloyd's still being a major player. Now, if we look at the impact of opening a new Arctic shipping routes, this is rather fascinating for a mariner such as myself, because we are still sailing on the routes that Magellan first successfully transited in 1522. Take a minute to think about that. If we look at changes in routes, then we have to go back. We go back to 1869 with the Suez Canal opening. And then in 1914, the Aecon was the first vessel to transit the Panama Canal. And when we look at it in this context, you can see new shipping routes don't open up too often for us. So this is something that, to say it's a new challenge is understating it tremendously. So when we look at the implementation of this, it's a rare occurrence. And as an industry, the marine insurance market is not known for rapid change. If you look up rapid change, you would not find marine insurance anywhere in that lexicon. So we have seen some momentum already from the IMO. I'm sure, as you're aware, the UN's arm of international shipping, the International Maritime Organization. So when we look at the Polar Code, we see standards for design, equipment, operation, as well as search and rescue. But the one thing that's a Achilles heel for a lot of this is nothing in the IMO's library gets updated too often. And this is really an area where we need to get out the best, the brightest, the most up-to-date information immediately. And we'll get into this a little bit because I personally have some views about how we should do that, how we should approach maritime training overall, not just for Arctic regions. So another important development here in April of 2020 was the EPPR. And these guidelines are important because it's the best practice model and the best practice method that we really are getting towards from a maritime standpoint, and it ties into existing methodology from vessel safety management systems, which both operators and insurers understand. The most important part about getting this out and having it accepted is you speak in a language that we're already using. It's similar to when we look at cyber. How do we make vessels better equipped for cyber exposures? Bring it into their safety management systems already that are already on board and being followed by crew members. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to make existing technology and methodology work for new risks and new hazard assessment. This presentation will be posted later. I highly recommend checking out some of these tools and resources links because I find them to be extremely helpful. So what are these challenges for marine insurance with regards to polar shipping? And it's a fast changing landscape. So staying abreast of the developments is one of the key things we work on, and we work closely with our clients as they understand and as they look to say, is this right for me? And we approach it from both a vessel, a crew, and a cargo, as well as marine liability exposures. That's what Allianz writes. We're a global property and casualty with a large marine book. So whether it's the vessel carrying it, the cargo that they're carrying, the crew on board those vessels manning it, or various liability exposures that those vessels can be subject to, it's all in our wheelhouse, as we say, to keep track of. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Polar Code's in effect, and training organizations now have started to, focus on ice navigation, focus curriculums, and also the machinery, maintenance, repair, and if we look over the horizon, 3D printing of vessel spares is something that is going to be critical as we move forward. So that all ties in, of course, into satellite availability, and in polar regions, that type of coverage can be challenging. So when we think about, well, we can make a call anywhere in the world, well, not necessarily in those regions. Now, as far as adaptation to this new environment, it's not just physical adaptation. It is also a company adaptation. It's companies that are entering into it, either shipping cargo or being the shipper, utilizing these routes. They have to understand some of the risks and exposures that are present. As I mentioned earlier, one of the keys to this, I see, is the training of crew and vessel operations. How are you going to train both shipboard and shoreside personnel to understand the risks that are present and reduce those exposures and make it a safer, and in the same breath, make it a more efficient operation? Because safer operations are more efficient operations by their very nature. So in the past, we have always focused on losses. Catastrophic losses have been the driver for maritime education. I started at the United States Merchant Marine Academy many, many years ago. I still have clear ideas of my plebe year being told, don't do this, this is what happens. My son is currently at Maine Maritime. He is still being told, don't do this, this is what happens. And we really need to change that. Personally, having spent a lot of time in education with educators and trying to educate people who don't always want to be educated, when we teach to a model of success, we have a greater chance of success. And when we look at polar operations, this is a wonderful potential for us to start to embrace this. And what I'm saying is that in the past, it has taken tremendous resources to capture the information we needed to do a vessel analysis, whether it's a grounding, a collision. when we look at the Andrea Doria was one of the key things we used to study, early use of radar and what they call the dance of death by turning the wrong way. With the metadata that we are now capable of collecting and do collect on a regular basis from vessels, we can now teach towards a successful voyage. And the reason this is key for Arctic is when we're talking about new waters and new navigation routes, we want to know where it's safe to go, not where it's unsafe to go. So if we're looking at avoiding incidents and accidents in the first place, we teach to a successful model. And that can get us on the right track immediately. One of the hamstring issues that we have is proper charting, proper bathymetric survey, and getting those charts out. If we start to use vessel AIS, automatic ship identification data, and VDR, voyage data recorded data, of successful voyages, we can then train follow-on vessels immediately to how to navigate successfully in these regions, rather than saying, don't go here, this is a danger area. You say, go here, this is where you have the suitable draft, this is where you don't have excessive currents and winds. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about changing some of our training methodology. So we look at data-driven solutions. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the metadata now for successful voyages, not just studying when things go wrong. And rather than training away from losses, we're adapting a training focus that's based on success. This will require more efficient use of the existing technology as well as development of new training concepts. That's not a doubt. It has to be done. But it's not a matter of collecting more data. This data is already being collected. It's a matter of utilizing it properly and implementing it then to the end user in a form that they can utilize and implement in a short term. So as I mentioned here, we're already gathering it. We're just not utilizing or sharing, and sharing is a key because a lot of this information vessel operators don't necessarily want out in the public domain. So we have to start to look at how do we address data security and metadata rights, because it's valuable commodity. So when we look at this and how can this new type of training regime help us and where does it have potential? I've just hit on some high points here of management, the training, navigation, engineering as well. And this will in turn allow for quicker and more efficient updating of the Polar Code, because we are identifying those best practices and we're sharing those best practices. As I mentioned earlier, with the bathymetric and the navigation data being limited, this type of data sharing will greatly improve voyage planning. It will get the lessons learned out there quicker. Near misses are key. If you want a successful maritime operation, you don't wait for things to go wrong. You raise your hand when you get close and you utilize a near miss methodology. It makes a tremendous difference. I have seen it firsthand in my years at sea. And work instruction, and then also as from a midterm to a longer term, we then look at vessel construction and claim settlement. Now, from the insurance standpoint, they always look at claim settlement because it has to be it has to make sense financially in order to extend the coverage. And that's just the nature of the business, and it is a business. I look at it as a safer operations, a more efficient operation, and any of these things will pay for themselves. So how does this then help us? I'm saying as a maritime industry, because we are challenged right now by attracting and keeping good mariners. And it's key for all stakeholders to have a trained and efficient manpower pool on board the vessels. So if we are state-of-the-art and we're implementing state-of-the-art, we then are going to be of a higher quality and a higher visibility, and we can attract better applicants and we can keep them. So as we identify the skill sets and training needed, this will help us both short, medium, and long term. And this ties in not just to polar, but also as we look at cyber exposures. All this has to be looked at as a holistic approach, because it's no one thing that we have to focus on. That's the challenge. We have to look overall at how we continue to operate day to day in our current envelope, and then how we look to expand and be successful in these new environments. So these future skills will be useful elsewhere. And that's flexibility to individual career paths, what helps us. If you want to maintain the best and brightest, you have to make sure that they're not going into something that they think is a dead end or an industry mired in itself. So as we look at the digitalization and automation of the shipping agency, the future seafarer must understand the use of this new technology, as well as still understanding good basic seamanship. And as we see in the polar regions, this is critical because you are on the forefront of the weather patterns. That's where they're starting. They hit you first. And one point here, the final point that I mentioned with regards to vessel manning. The minimum crew complement should not be considered as the maximum crew manning scale. You need trained, qualified crew for when things go wrong in order to prevent them from going further wrong. If you do not have a trained and adequate manpower pool, when something bad goes wrong, happens, it will go worse quickly. It's just the nature of it. If they don't know how to respond when things are not going right, it will make things go much worse. So as I mentioned earlier, marine insurance looks to the past to predict the future. That's how rates are. They utilize historical information. And we have faced this previous, when we went from sail to steam and from steam to motor and those changes in propulsion. Early on when I started, we were still steamships with fully manned engine rooms. We had to go to unmanned engine rooms to be efficient, as they said. And that led, in course, to reduced manning levels. And we've been able to adapt to these, in some cases better than others, and in some cases the pendulum might have swung a little too far. But the key to all of these, as we're facing these new challenges, is that we have to be able to assess vessel operations to see if it's successful before it leads to a loss. You want to understand that the route is safe. You want to make sure that your weather windows are accurate, that you're not overstressing crew equipment for the prevailing circumstances before failure. And in order to do that, you have to assess current operations. So this will help if we look at the data, because we can find out how close to the edge they are. And that's one of the keys when we look at this. It's not just for the vessel user. It's also for the vessel routing, and it's for the governments that control those shipping routes to understand what they have. Can we get a larger ship, or do we have too large a ship? Do we have to look at a draft limitation, similar to what we already do currently in the Panama Canal during an El Nino or a La Nina event? We reduce the draft because of the reduction in rainfall. Well, same thing if we're looking at currents, ice flow, or wind conditions. So those new operational needs need to be incorporated both for current operations and then also for new vessel development. And one of the keys to this is machinery reliability. As I said in the beginning, this is a harsh environment on personnel and machinery. So that machinery reliability needs to be addressed. One of the keys on a slow-speed diesel is seawater temps. And when you start getting fluctuations in seawater temps, it has such a profound effect on lube oil settings. And that can lead to a lot of alarms for an unattended engine room. And when you start to do that, you wear on your engine room personnel because they're supposed to be at a rest time. Instead, they're in the engine room answering alarms. So these all tie into an overall safe vessel operation portfolio. So when we look at Arctic operations and insurance risk, how are they impacting each other? As I said earlier, these real-world operations are complicated. We have to take a look at multiple threads at the same. We can't just focus on one approach. There will be human error. There always is, even in automated operations, because you've got somebody setting that automation up. So we have to understand where in the process that error could occur and then ensure we have redundancy to limit the impact of any error. Checks and balance. Risk, by definition, the lack of certainty about the outcome of making a particular choice. It is always there. The risk cannot go away completely. We have to understand it, manage it. But in order to manage it, we first have to identify it. And once again, the need for qualified mariners, it's real. It has to be addressed, and it's not just for vessel operations, it's also shoreside operations, technical support. If you don't have people in an office who have been to sea managing a vessel, it is really difficult to get the empathy you need. And you know, you don't often talk about empathy in engineering operations, but it's real. It has to be addressed because you are living and working in that environment. It's your home as well as your workplace. And if you think you can have a bad day at the office, try eating, working for 180 to 365 days. That's an office environment. I just wanted to touch in closing or towards the end here on the bottom line. And what's driving the routes from our standpoint for supply chain supply is shorter shipping routes. So innovations like shorter shipping routes are not, they're not being driven by any type of better instincts of man. These are efficiencies, and they don't automatically lead to improvement in safety. So focused efforts are needed to ensure that safe vessel operations result in zero losses. It's not going to happen by chance. It has to be a focused, concerted effort, and it's going to need a new approach in some regards in order to implement this change faster and more efficiently. And I just wanted to share this with you. Thank you for spending some time with me today. And this is my contact info if anyone has any follow-up. Kelsey?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andrew. I have a background a little bit in insurance, and it's just a fascinating topic, especially when you expand the definition from what's my rate into how do we create an inclusive environment that's both safe and economically feasible. So thank you so much for your presentation today. I did see we had one question here before we transition. Again, just a reminder, at 9:30, we will transition to the next track of presentation. So you'll want to navigate the same way you got in this room to the next room you're interested in. But the question came from Pierre. Thank you so much for asking. It says, generally speaking, how more expensive is it to insure ships transiting the Arctic Northeast Passage or Northwest Passage? Best case scenario. And does the Polar Code go far enough to support that?
Right, and this is where I put on my marine risk consultant and not my broker or agent's hat. I am not an underwriter. Yeah. And as a result, I do not deal with rate. Sorry, Pierre, great question. But unfortunately, that's not in my wheelhouse.
Gotcha.
When rates come up, that's when I go to my underwriters who I support. Yeah.
You go hands off. Well, how about just in general then? You know, the follow-up was, does the Polar Code go far enough? In your perspective as a mariner, do you think that they have provided us a great launching point? Do you think it's fairly comprehensive? What's your feeling on where we stand today with the Polar Code?
It can go further. Mm-hmm. It needs to be updated more efficiently, and it has to just be stronger. Personally, my personal feeling. Unfortunately, in an era where shippers, vessel operators are being stretched and pulled from all directions, they'll spend more time, unfortunately, looking for loopholes than they will for looking for, you know, adaptation. So yeah. It's got to be tough. And trust me, from a mariner standpoint and from a concerned citizen standpoint, I want it to be. Mm-hmm. They can do it. You can make people do the right thing, but unfortunately, in some cases, you have to make them do the right thing. Until that point where you get enough momentum, where you can identify, just like the IX, where you can identify an IX weight and you can identify other classification societies, then you start to get traction. But right now, it's the Wild West, really. It's just opening. So it really needs, you can always give it more rein. It's tough to pull in after she's gotten her head, you know? You can always loosen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I completely understand where you are at there. Well, let me wrap this up so that folks can be on time to their next presentation. Andrew, thank you so very much for presenting today. We will take the recording, and the plan is to have it at the ADAC website here in the future, but we'll send an email blast out and let everyone know if they'd like to share this with friends or colleagues. Again, you're going to want to go back either to the agenda that was emailed to you or the ADAC website. We have presentations coming up in track 2. We've got one with the International Maritime Group in the Susitna Hall, I always forget the name. And then we've got a presentation by Borum Energy Solutions that will be in the Denali Hall. So thank you again. I will see you in the next presentation. Take care.